Okay, we're recording. I am Brandon Polite, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois. And I'm joined by Robbie Kubala, who's Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the University of Texas at Austin, in Austin, Texas. Robbie, thank you so much for joining me.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me, Brandon.
Cool. So we're talking about your article, The Aesthetics of Crossword Puzzles, which came out last year, 2023, from the British Journal of Aesthetics. And in that paper, surprisingly enough, you discuss the aesthetics of crossword puzzles. And so just as a basic question to get us started, what got you interested in crossword puzzles as a topic of philosophical exploration?
Yeah, so I guess I can start with a kind of autobiographical answer and then maybe a more substantive philosophical answer. And the autobiographical answer is that it seemed like a bunch of my friends were writing pieces in what you might think of as applied aesthetics, where they're working on specific genres or mediums or kinds of aesthetic objects that people weren't writing about in the past. Think about the short story or popular radio or country music or a very, very long list of things like that. And I thought, I'm going to try to do that also. I want to try to develop an aesthetics of some previously understudied and underexplored genre. And I happen to be a longtime crossword solver and, in fact, a competitive speed solver, which raises its own issues when it comes to aesthetic appreciation. But in case people aren't aware of this phenomenon, as probably most are not, there is, in fact, a tournament every year, the American Crossword Puzzle Tournament in Stamford, Connecticut. And it's been going on since the 70s. And people sit in the Marriott Ballroom in Stamford, Connecticut, and they solve a series of 7 puzzles over the course of the weekend for speed. And it turns out that I was pretty fast and got a lot faster, especially when I started solving multiple puzzles a day. And yeah, so I've loved crosswords. My partner Kyle Mahowald, who is a linguist here at UT Austin, is a crossword constructor. And so I had a bit of a personal connection to this as well, and he helped me to get more into solving. So that's the autobiographical answer. The philosophical answer is I really was thinking about kind of what are the limit cases of aesthetic engagement and what kinds of previously underexplored areas could afford aesthetic experiences and indeed merit, as I argue in the paper, aesthetic engagement. And probably the thing that was the proximal cause of my being able to write this paper was Thi Nguyen's book on games. A wonderful book, as everyone would agree. And it really kind of opened a lot of us up to thinking about the aesthetics of agency in gameplay generally. And so I think without that book, I would not have been able to see the resources that I needed to get into thinking about the aesthetics of agency in crossword puzzles, solving crossword puzzles in particular, even though, as I argue in the paper, it's not just the aesthetics of agency that gives rise to aesthetic value in crosswords. It's also the visual features, the features of the crossword grid itself, and the poetic features, the linguistic features of the language and the clues that go into making a puzzle.
Awesome. So I didn't know about the speed solving thing, so I want to get into that at some point because that sounds really awesome. And so I think maybe the place to go from there is you mentioned that in your paper you're talking about why crossword puzzles merit aesthetic experience and aesthetic attention, and you're responding to a couple of views that deny that, right? That crosswords aren't the sort of thing that merit aesthetic experience. And so can you give the opposing view, and then we could get into your reasons for rejecting it?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I can think of basically 4 sources of skepticism. So some of this goes beyond what I said in the paper, or maybe sort of precedes what I said in the paper, because you might not find these to be especially troubling objections. One thought people have is that crosswords It's just a bunch of rules. It's a bunch of rules for entering letters into a grid. And, art doesn't have rules. So crosswords can't be the kind of thing that, like art, merits aesthetic engagement. I think most people would agree who do any philosophy of art that that's false. There's all kinds of rules in art. If you're going to make a sonnet, you have to follow certain rules. If you're going to write an opera, there's certain rules. And maybe art is a domain in which we can be more flexible and expansive in breaking or stretching those rules and conventions, but they're still there. So that's one reason you might be skeptical. Another is that crosswords are only solvable once. So it seems like a more kind of fleeting or transient object. You do it once and then you toss it in the recycling bin and that's it. I think there too, there are cases of aesthetic appreciation of things that can only be experienced once. I mean, certainly scenes of natural beauty like sunsets, for instance, are famously fleeting and transient. And there are even some artworks, performances that can only be experienced once. So I don't think that's a very good reason to reject the idea that crosswords merit aesthetic engagement. A third reason I do talk about in the paper, and this is the idea from Aaron Smuts, that crosswords have only one solution. So not only are they only solvable once, you might think, but they have only one solution. And Smuts says there could be no such thing as an aesthetically qualified property of one solution. And that's something that I really kind of take issue with in the paper. I think that the solution of a crossword can be achieved kind of more or less elegantly, say, where elegance is an aesthetic property. And so I think if we think of crosswords not just as a series of letters arranged in a grid, but in terms of clue-answer pairs, we can think about more or less elegant ways of cluing the same answers, the same phrases. So my friend Natan Last is a constructor for the New York Times and the New Yorker. And one of my favorite clue answer pairs comes from a New Yorker puzzle he wrote. And the answer is U2, Y-O-U-T-O-O, just the phrase U2. Decent, idiomatic phrase in the English language, but he really elevates it with this clue. You could imagine a very boring clue that just says something like, and the same goes, something like that. Polite response to compliment. And Natan writes, awkward knee-jerk response to a waiter saying, enjoy your meal. And that is the clue that he gives. And this is so wonderful. It's such a great clue for this answer because it calls up this experience that all of us have had when the waiter says, enjoy your meal. And you just blurt out you too, because we're so used to just uttering this kind of polite banality in these contexts. So I go through a number of examples that show that that can be a way of making your answers, clue answer pairs, more aesthetically engaging. And then finally, and this is really where I follow Thi Nguyen, you might think that solving a crossword, it's just too goal-oriented. But there's something kind of importantly disinterested about aesthetic experience. And there's a lot to say on this score. But basically here, I think one thing we can do is say, as Nguyen does about games, that even though it's true that crossword solving is a goal-oriented process, we are striving practically toward the attainment of a goal, a completed grid, we can nonetheless take up, if you think disinterestedness is characteristic of aesthetic engagement, we can take up in memory a disinterested attitude toward our own interested activities. I think you could push this further and suggest it's actually something we can do sort of simultaneously, but that's something for a kind of longer discussion. And just as there are lots of artworks that can only be appreciated in memory, so think about any kind of temporally extended piece, a large-scale musical work. If I'm appreciating Beethoven's Ninth, then I'm going to be appreciating parts of it in memory necessarily in order to grasp the structure of the whole. And similarly, too, we can appreciate in memory our experience, a very recent experience in most cases, of solving a puzzle. So those are some reasons for skepticism and some of the ways in which I want to push back.
Yeah, so maybe the place to go is to pursue more the line that you're taking from T, right? That solving a crossword puzzle is a goal-directed activity, but it's, not honest, or rather, yeah, it's not unesthetic because of that,
That's
right?
right.
That maybe in a traditional Kantian sense, it's an interested activity, therefore it can't be aesthetic. But T gives really good reasons for rejecting that view. And so, can you talk more about how you think of solving a crossword puzzle in terms of generating an aesthetic experience that's sort of rich and valuable and worth engaging with?
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, I guess I can start by talking about those features that crossword solving has with other games and other kinds of what Nguyen calls striving activities. And that has to do with this category of the aesthetics of agency. And here I kind of follow T in talking about these different harmonies, practical harmonies that we can experience in our own interested striving activity. And the two that I focus on for crosswords, one is the harmony of solution. So this is the kind of felt pleasingness of a fit or a match between some kind of obstacle, some kind of practical obstacle, and then some solution to that obstacle. And I think the harmony of solution is the kind of thing we can experience when, for instance, we see a clue like Natan's, awkward knee-jerk response to a waiter saying, enjoy your meal. And I'm thinking, and then I hit upon, oh, it's you too. Or maybe I'm looking at the intersections in the grid, and that helps me to see, oh, it's blank, oh, blank, T, oh, blank. What fits that pattern? And I go, oh, it's you too. And it's that moment where we experience this practical harmony, the harmony of solution. So that's one kind of practical harmony that Nguyen talks about. And the other is, that's relevant for me, is what's known as the harmony of capacity. And this is something which for Nguyen is specifically tied to difficulty. So this is the way in which we can have this felt harmony in the way that our own agential capacities are fitting the demands of the world. And we especially experience this when we are hitting up against the limits of what we are able to do. And I think this is why many people seeking this kind of experience, the experience of this property, go in for very difficult puzzles. People who really, even though they can't always finish them, sit down on a Saturday morning and try to solve the Saturday New York Times puzzle, the hardest of the week. This is why some people who are more advanced solvers solve some crosswords down clues only. They don't even look at the across clues. They just have this practice of solving downs only, is they're trying to really attain that harmony of capacity and pushing themselves to their limits. So that's another way in which we have experienced the aesthetics of agency when it comes to crosswords. There's lots of other ways, but those I think two especially salient ones when it comes to puzzle solving.
Yeah, and with that last type of case that you bring up of the down solvers, right? We only solve the down clues, right? That's an obstacle that the solver themselves is introducing, right? Similar to someone who's only doing pen and ink, right? That I'm only going to do this in ink, and if I screw up, it's done.
Totally. Yes, exactly. So this is something that we sort of have to calibrate based on our own difficulty level. There's a kind of Aristotelian relativity in play here where, I got to find what is the right level for me with my capacities. But yeah, absolutely solving in pen and ink, setting a time limit, as in the American Crossword Puzzle Tournament. If you don't finish within 15 minutes, then you don't get to keep trying to solve the puzzle. Downs only. There's all kinds of practices that surrounding a created crossword that enable people to try to get to this experience and this aesthetic value property. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so pretty much every morning before I get out of bed, I do 3 crossword puzzles on my phone. So I do the Atlantic's crossword puzzle, I do Vox's crossword puzzle, and I do LA Times. Now, obviously, like Sunday, I'm going to get out of bed at some point before I finish. But I'm doing them on my phone, which is different, I think, at least in terms of like tactile thing, and
Yes.
versus doing it on paper with pen or pencil. And what you're describing makes sense, right? Like Atlantic's crossword puzzle gets more difficult as the week goes on, right? And so like Monday, I'm trying to get it done in under 50 seconds. Like Tuesday, I'm trying to get it done in under a minute and a half. And then Thursday, I'm just trying to get it done because Thursday seems to be the hard one for the Atlantic. And yeah, and so like I'm totally getting what you're saying. And what I find interesting of like my own experience with crosswords is with the more difficult ones, it's the case of like for me, like Atlantic's Thursday puzzle is often really difficult because it's often like just trivia, like pop culture trivia. And like if I haven't seen that movie or watched Game of Thrones, which I haven't, then which often seems to be the case with Atlantics, is like there's clearly a
Yeah.
Game of Thrones fan writing it. They're like, yeah, I don't know who Ned Stark is. And so like I'm not gonna get this clue. And so it's like, well, I could cheat, right? I could just go look that up, but that's
Yeah.
not fun. Or often what happens is, with my own experience of more difficult crossword puzzles, it's like I have to like step away from it for a while, and then I come back, and then I get one clue, and that one clue unlocks another solution, and then that opens up another one, and then like these things are coming together, and then I feel like okay, like I pushed past whatever block I was having, and now like the thing is opening up and unfolding, and I'm seeing how these different pieces are fitting together in like this really rich and interesting way.
Yeah, totally. I love that aha moment that you get with an especially difficult puzzle. So I was just last month at the American Crossword Puzzle Tournament competing, and there's the notorious Puzzle Five. So of the seven regular tournament puzzles, Puzzle Five is famously difficult and often contains something extremely non-obvious in its theme or something about how you're entering the answers into the grid. And in this case, what it was that all clues containing the letter C, you had to just drop the C from the clue in order to get the accurate clue. So, for instance, chill worker had a three-letter answer, and you had to realize that you drop the C and it becomes hill worker, and then you're looking for ant. It actually disappeared twice in the puzzle. There's another one that said chill worker, and it was a four-letter answer. And in that case, it was aid, AIDE, so like a Capitol Hill aid. And the reason that I discovered it was trying to fit something into the grid that just didn't fit. And it was the clue, I love this, McCain opponent. And it was five letters. I thought, oh, McCain opponent, that's Obama. Like, I'm going to throw that in. And then it just wasn't working with any of the crossings. And it turns out that the answer was rival. You take out both C's and it's main opponent, and that clues rival. And I had just this wonderful moment, which is also extremely frustrating at the time because I wasted sort of 4 minutes trying to figure this out. But once you get it, it's just this fantastic experience that I think has this aesthetic property that Nguyen is talking about, this sense of harmony, finally. And one thing I talk about in the paper is there's also the kind of negative aesthetics of this, the experience of disharmony you can have when you fail to solve a puzzle. It's unresolved disharmony. Just like in music, you hear a sort of dissonant chord that never resolves. That too bears aesthetic value properties. You can have something like that in the aesthetics of puzzles and games more generally. Yeah.
Yeah, and in the paper you refer to it as akin to the sublime, right? Where like there's this mismatch between our abilities and the thing out there. And I think that's like a non-obvious connection to a crossword puzzle, right? When we think of the sublime, right, it's like these gigantic things in nature that are overwhelming us, or, the all of the stars in the heavens, right? Just like the mathematical sublime, right? And a crossword puzzle doesn't seem straightforwardly sublime in that sense, and yet you're making this connection. So could you talk about that a bit
Yeah,
more?
sure. I mean, here I was inspired by a very brief kind of throwaway mention in a paper by Jane Forsey on the Sublime from Jack in, I think, 2007, where she writes about the kind of as a prosaic instance of the sublime, the experience of being unable to solve a New York Times Saturday puzzle. She talks about this cognitive failure that she experiences. And I think it's nice to think of this as a kind of prosaic or everyday instance of the sublime, in that there is still this sense of the inability of my cognitive and other faculties to adequately grasp or glom onto some feature of the world. It's not being produced by some experience of immensity necessarily, as in the Kantian or the Burkean sublime, but it is nonetheless this disharmony of being unable to fit my own agential and cognitive capacities to the demands of the world, in this case, the demand of the crossword puzzle to be solved. I do think it's going to be importantly different from the Kantian sublime. I mean, ultimately, the Kantian sublime, we take pleasure in the ability of some of our faculties to adequately comprehend the world. So even if I'm presented with this perceptual experience of the ocean and have this case of sort of immensity and magnitude, or of the thunderstorm and the sort of immensity and power, and the ocean, I can't take it all in perceptually. Sensibility cannot, and imagination cannot work to sort of take in the totality of the object in just contrast to a statue or a picture on my desk that I can easily sort of take in, but reason can, right? I have this concept of infinity, and that is adequate to comprehend the world, and we ultimately take pleasure in that. I don't think there's going to be any kind of analog of that sort of pleasurable meta moment in the case where I haven't solved the crossword yet. So maybe there's some differences still to the Kantian sublime, but probably there's more to be said there.
Yeah, it's just like frustrating, right? Why can't
Yes.
I do this? What's wrong with me? Why did they
But
make
at
it
the
so
first
hard?
moment, you haven't gotten to the second or the later moments of the Kantian sublime. Yeah.
Yeah. Can we talk a bit about the competitive stuff? Because
Yeah.
you mentioned it a couple times and I want to dig into that. And so, thinking about T's book and gameplay, right? There are achievement players who care just about the win, and there are striving players who care, are seeking the win for the sake of the valuable aesthetic experience that seeking the win makes available to them. And as a competitor in crossword solving, where would you categorize yourself? Or are you sort of, I mean, I think obviously you could sort of transition back and forth, like over the case of a competition, right? Where it's like, God damn it, I need to win versus like, I'm trying to win and whoa, this really cool thing opened up. And the way you described with the crossword puzzle where you have to drop all the C's from the clues.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I definitely will say that I appreciated that more in memory than at the time, but I do think I appreciated it at the time as well. Um, yeah. I mean, this is a good question. I tend to think that like with Steph Patridge and her response to T, that there's maybe a little bit more mixing of these kinds of play than T seems to want to allow for in the book. So, how exactly to account for that is kind of difficult theoretical question, but just my own experience is one that, yeah, it seems to be both. There are cases where I am in it for the win as a competitive solver. And then there are some cases where I'm in it for the sake of the experience of striving to solve the puzzle. But I guess I kind of think that. So I was just at this conference actually on crosswords last month, and there was a panel on speed solving, and someone asked a bunch of people who are like even better than me, like truly tippy top speed solvers, can finish a New York Times Monday in under a minute, kind of thing. Um, what is your experience like? And one of them just said, well, if you give me a clue, I'm just going to give you the answer as fast as I can come up with it. Like, I'm not even thinking about being a speed solver now. It's not like a choice I have. I'm just actually humming along as my abilities dispose me to do. And so I kind of want to say there that, yeah, it's not the case that just being a speed solver means you can't also be kind of a striving player in T sense, even if you're going as fast as you can. Yeah. I mean, I guess maybe I should say something a little bit more about the kind of other aspects of crossword solving that aren't just instances of the aesthetics of agency in games more generally, because crosswords have this visual element, this element of the grid, and crosswords, the medium of a solved crossword puzzle is language. These are word puzzles, and I think both of those things the aesthetics of agency looms really large when we think about solving, but I think crosswords, the poetic and idiomatic language element is like a huge source of aesthetic value in puzzles. And I think a lot of what makes something a really good puzzle, a better puzzle than others, is the language that people use and the range of cultural references. You mentioned that the Atlantic has a lot of Game of Thrones references. That's the kind of thing that can make a puzzle better or worse. It's the kind of thing that can give a puzzle a voice or a style. And these are clearly back in the aesthetic realm as well. So there's all these other elements of puzzles also that I think when I appreciate a really good puzzle, it's not just the experience that it afforded me of solving it, but it's actually features of the puzzle itself and the language that it's using and the way that the clues get you to the answer.
Yeah, and there are some conventions in crossword puzzles, like if a clue ends in a question mark, then the answer is going to be a pun or, like
Yeah.
something that's groan inducing in terms of, oh, okay, I get it.
Yes, exactly like that. Yeah.
Right. And in terms of like style of crossword, there's this general division that you point to in the article between cryptic puzzles, which are sort of British style crosswords, versus the non-cryptic style, which are the more US style, which is just based, well, maybe just is a wrong word, but based largely on just trivial knowledge and vocab knowledge. And I'm not really familiar with cryptic puzzles. And so could you talk more about that divide and like what the aesthetic differences between, engaging with one versus engaging with another?
Yes. I mean, this is something that I am still learning more about as I get more and more into cryptic puzzles myself. And I think, like I've heard other speed solvers of American crosswords have also talked about moving toward cryptics, in part because they're so much harder and it's just much more difficult to speed solve a cryptic. No one's having a tournament to speed solve a cryptic. It's much more tricky. And it's not just the kind of throwing in of like, oh, I know the answer, oh, I know the answer, oh, I know the answer, and these match and whatnot. It's much more about taking your time over each clue, and you have the time to appreciate them. So the main difference is, as you say, American puzzles tend to be sort of trivia or vocabulary or cultural references. And in an American crossword puzzle, every letter crosses two different answers, or there's two answers that cross at that letter. So the way of checking whether your answer is correct or not is to make sure it fits with both the across clue and the down clue. British style cryptic puzzles aren't like that. They contain what are known as unchecked squares. So squares that don't cross two answers. And you might think, well, there needs to be a means of double checking that your answer is correct. And in a British puzzle, that comes from the fact that the clue always contains two parts, a kind of straight definition that's just a synonym of the answer, and then a kind of cryptic, elliptical way of getting to the clue. So take the cryptic clue, stares at torn pages. 5, and you get the enumeration of cryptic clues by convention. So I'm looking for a 5-letter answer, and you've told me stares at torn pages. In this case, it turns out that what I'm looking for is a word that is synonymous with stares at, and that is an anagram of the word pages. So we've got the stares at part, that's the straight definition, and then we've got torn pages, which is the elliptical clue. And in this instance, torn signals an anagram. And that tells me to rearrange the letters of the word pages, and that gives me gapes. So stares at, in this case, is a synonym for gapes. Now, you might see stares at as a clue in an American style puzzle. But if that were to clue the answer gapes, I would need the crossings, because it might also be gazes, say, and I would need to know, oh, is that a P there or is that a Z as the third letter? It might be something totally different, like ogles, and that would still fit the 5-letter enumeration. So the double checking in the cryptic clue comes from it's having these two parts. There's all kinds of different ways of getting to that elliptical of cluing that elliptical definition. Not all of them are anagrams. There's also kind of puns and double definitions and inclusions and reversals and all these different ways of transforming words to get you the answer. So there's a lot more kind of tricksiness that goes on and a lot more room for a different kind of creativity in making cryptic puzzles.
And do you feel like with cryptic puzzles, because of the trickiness, because of all of the different possibilities and the pretty much impossibility of checking your answer by looking at the down or across clue, does that mean, do you think, or does that indicate or suggest that these cryptic style puzzles, like the harmony of capacity and solution, is amplified more compared to the traditional US?
Yeah, so I think this is a good way in which you could argue for the aesthetic superiority. I don't make this argument myself. I don't know what I think about it. But if one wanted to argue for the aesthetic superiority of cryptics, as I know some people want to do, I think the harmony of solution is exactly something you could point to. There's just a lot more room for getting that real sense of like a fit or a match, in part because you're getting the two different ways of arriving at the same string that constitutes the answer. A couple other examples of cryptic clues. This is one of my favorites. Actress in Titanic and iceberg encounter. And the enumeration is 7, 6. So I'm looking for a 2-word answer, 7 letters, 6 letters. And it turns out that the answer is clued by actress, and it's Candace Bergen. And the letters CANDACB are just appear in Titanic and iceberg encounter, and it's just right there. And I just love that, because the Titanic and iceberg encounter is such this wonderful, meaningful semantic unit in its own right, and yet it also contains, just in terms of the string of characters, this actress's name. So it's just a wonderful discovery, kind of about the English language, that it has this in it. Another great cryptic clue I love, actually one of the reviewers of the paper introduced me to a cryptic setter whose name is Sarah Hayes, and one of her clues in a Guardian puzzle in the UK was woman in charge of automobile driver, 6. Oh no, sorry, I messed that up. Woman in charge of automobile club, 6. I just gave away the answer. And the answer is driver. And this just turns out to be a double definition. So you have to re-parse it as woman in charge of automobile. And then you also, so you sort of parse it there. And then you think of another word that is a synonym for club. They've got a word that's a synonym for both club and woman in charge of automobile, and it's driver. And one of the cool things that the referee pointed out was that there's a kind of implicit kind of gender critique in here, which is that it will take many people a longer time to get to the idea of woman in charge of automobile club. What could that even mean? Like, the automobile club is something which is sort of so masculine coded. You've got woman here. The answer could also have been man in charge of automobile club or person in charge of automobile club, because whoever's in charge of an automobile, that's not a gendered expression. But in this instance, that extra little bit can give you this experience of being reminded of, say, sort of gender and the way that it operates in our society. And so it's another sort of cool feature of cluing in these ways.
Awesome. How do you know when you've completely solved a cryptic puzzle?
It's by knowing that you know how to arrive at each answer in both ways. And there are times when I have solved a cryptic in the sense that I've filled in all of the boxes, but there are one or two that I'm like, this is the only thing that fits here, because every answer crosses, a couple letters. So I get some information just from the crossings, but I don't actually know how to arrive at the answer through the elliptical part of the clue. And then sometimes I'll actually, once it's finished, have to spend time going back and kind of figuring out how I did that, back solving, if you like. So yeah, that's the way But just as with American style puzzles, there's this double checking element. In fact, the philosopher, my friend Kenny Iswaran, has argued in an unpublished paper that one characteristic mark of puzzles in general is that they not only contain a means of finding the answer, but a means of double checking whether the answer is in fact correct. So this is a feature of all puzzles, Kenny thinks. So just as jigsaw puzzles, you have both the fit, the way it interlocks, and then the image that is represented by the jigsaw puzzle. There's two different ways of arriving at it. Similarly, in both American style and British style crossword puzzles.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to talk about was precisely the relationship between crossword puzzles and other types of puzzles, be they word puzzles or jigsaw puzzles and other type things. And so you pointed to one there. And do you have other thoughts on like the connection between crosswords and say jigsaw puzzles? And then we can get into more word games like Wordle, Quirtle, Octordle, that type stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I don't really do jigsaw puzzles very often. I maybe do sort of one a year or something like that. And for me, it goes back to the medium of a word puzzle being language. And, as someone who works in and with and around words, I'm very attracted to art forms whose medium is language. And one of the things that I really love about crossword puzzles is the way that a phrase can evoke so much. So unlike reading works of narrative fiction, where you're prescribed to imagine in pretty constrained ways, if I read a novel, I'm going to prescribe to imagine the way that the scenes and characters are described. But as the critic and crossword solver and English professor Anna Scheckman writes, the potential for words to mean so much with so little context is the crossword puzzler's great pleasure. And I think that's absolutely right. The ability of a phrase to call up a whole imaginary context. So we're not prescribed to imagine in such particular or determinate ways, but the imagination kind of play with what is evoked by a certain word or context. So one of the entries that my partner debuted years ago in a crossword was this old thing. And I love this. I love a phrase like this old thing, because it just reminds me of people I know who have said that, or it calls up this whole sort of attitude or stance of a person who, on being complimented on a shirt or something, would just go, this old thing. And it's just so funny to me. And the way that it sort of engages this play of imagination, absent so much other context, is, I think, something really special about crosswords. I think it's what makes them very close to maybe even a kind of poetry. And it's no accident, I think, that many of the greatest crossword constructors today are also poets. They're also people who are working with language in poetry.
Yeah, and I think that connection's really strong, right? Where as opposed to a novel where you just have so many words to sift through, a poem, each word is precisely in that place, and the economy of language is so important, and the ability of short phrases or even a single word to evoke so many possibilities, right? And so like that connection to crossword seems incredibly strong.
Yeah, definitely. There's been some really interesting work done by sort of cultural historians and historians of modernism on this connection and on the way that people, so the contemporary crossword kind of originated in 1913, sort of word cross puzzles. And then the crossword was sort of standardized by 1950 by Margaret Farrar, the editor of the New York Times crossword. And she's the one who instituted various conventions to sort of make it what it is. The Times was publishing a Sunday puzzle starting in 1942, but by 1950 they'd moved to the daily puzzles, which are basically, they've been the same more or less for now almost 75 years of New York Times crosswords. And some people have talked about the way in which this turn the crossword into this kind of modernist form. So I cite in the paper my friend Adrienne Raffel, who wrote a wonderful book called Thinking Inside the Box, which is a kind of cultural history of crosswords. And she talks about crosswords as a cross between latte art and a Mondrian. So latte art getting the sort of more fleeting, but nonetheless genuinely aesthetic. And then the Mondrian, the kind of modernist grid and the sort of layout and all that the grid evokes with its neatness and its right angles and the black and white. And it's just really rich kind of history. And there's a lot more to be said about that.
Yeah, and on the grid art, a skeptic and might say something like, well, how appealing aesthetically is a crossword grid, right? Like every People magazine has a crossword, like we're used to seeing these things, unlike a Modrian where it's like you have to go to a museum or look in an art book or something of that sort. Like, they're so common and they're so usual. Like, how visually appealing can a crossword grid be? And so how would you respond to that? Because one part of your argument, as you point out, in addition to the agency stuff, right, is that the aesthetic appeal or the aesthetic interest in crosswords is that visual appeal of the grid, in addition to the poetry language stuff that you've been talking about. And so, like, how visually appealing is a crossword grid, do you think?
Yeah, good. I mean, so I share some of your skepticism here. I mean, I name this in the paper grid art. I think it is a real but minor source of aesthetic value in crossword puzzles. I mean, part of why I think it is real is that there is this practice of grid art, which is, again, kind of an optional practice that not all constructors engage in, just as not all solvers engage in downs-only solving. Where some puzzles, the arrangement of black and white squares, even before you solve the puzzle, forms an image. So there's a very cute one of a panda, for instance, from the New York Times. Some invite you to trace an image after the puzzle is complete. So one of my favorite New York Times Sunday puzzles is themed around René Magritte's Treachery of Images. That's the This Is Not a Pipe painting. And you are invited, there's a number of circled squares in the grid. And once you're done, you trace a shape and it traces the shape of a pipe. And so you get this additional kind of layer commentary on, well, this too is not a pipe, this is a crossword, and this is really not even a good visual representation of a pipe because you have to draw the letters yourself, and you've probably done you have to draw the pipe yourself, you've not done a good job. So I like the way in which that plays with that kind of that work of art. But I agree, in most cases, this is not something which is going to be very integral to the solver's experience. I will say, though, that I have friends in the constructing community who really do seem to have strong aesthetic preferences for the layout of black and white squares. So, whether people like that the top left corner could be a black square. So, we typically see that it's, we start right in the top left, but maybe the layout of the grid is such that you're starting with black squares and you've got a different arrangement that's unusual. There are features that you can attend to here that I think do bear real aesthetic value, even though I sort of understand and even to some extent share your skepticism about the potential to confer much value of these grid art features.
Yeah, right. You sort of have to be a connoisseur of crosswords to be able to be like, oh, there's a black square there where normally there wouldn't be.
Yeah, that's right. It's pretty in-groupy thing. Yeah.
But I mean, I think that's important, right? That there can be such things as connoisseurs of crosswords or aficionados of crosswords who have really strong aesthetic preferences towards one type of crossword or another, one type of grid art or another. Like, that seems really important to thinking about engaging with crosswords as an aesthetic practice.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I don't put too much weight on this in the paper, but I do think that two pretty characteristic marks of aesthetic domains or classes of aesthetic objects or aesthetic practices is that they tend to provoke disagreement, more disagreement than we would expect about sort of non-evaluative features of things, and that they tend to support robust practices of criticism. And it is a fact about the sociology of the crossworld that there are a number of online blogs that provide full dress criticism of crosswords. You can read reviews, multiple reviews of the New York Times crossword puzzle every day. And I think that a lot of what these reviewers are picking up on are precisely the features that I have talked about. So the experience you get while solving, the kind of elegance of a clue answer pair, the difficulty level, and then the answers that it contains. Is there a lot of like really boring answers? Is it a lot of like really exciting, fresh, lively, in the language fill? Is the theme clever? Is the theme really trite and banal? Is it just too cutesy or too gimmicky? We see all kinds of aesthetic language when we look at these reviews. And again, I think that's the kind of thing that's some evidence that these really are an aesthetic object. And this is an aesthetic practice that goes into the solving and appreciating of crosswords.
And related to that, one question that you don't go into and you explicitly bring up and set aside in the article is the question of, are crossword puzzles art? Right, which would then indicate that crossword constructors are artists, right? And so, I think you're right to dodge that question. I think the is it art question is generally like a non-interesting one, but for the sake of doing something non-interesting, right? Like, do you have thoughts on that question of whether crosswords ever count as art? And maybe it's a question of some do, some don't.
Yeah. Let me start actually. I'll quote you something from Will Shortz, the New York Times crossword editor. So in an interview a couple years ago, he was asked this question of whether crosswords can be art. And he said, I think crosswords are a minor art form. But he said something else really interesting. He said, only in the modern days, so I'll just read this quote, if you go back 40 or 50 years, crosswords were just collections of words. They were a nice craft, but the constructor's personality wasn't really coming through in the puzzle. I think that's part of what makes something an art. It's the human nature of it. The person's personality is expressed through this form. So that's Will Shortz's take on this question. And I think it's really interesting that he's getting at, although I'm sure he's not familiar with this, one of the major theories of artistic style, the theory that artistic style is the expression of personality in a work. And it's the fact that some crosswords, but not all, are stylistic. They have a style because they express their creator's personality. Now, that's not the only theory of style on the market. Nick Riggle and Rob Hopkins think that artistic style is the expression of ideals that an artist has for their art, nothing to do with their personality, actual or implied. And I think either whatever sort of theory of style and art you want, you can get to the conclusion that no, like crosswords do have a style, and at least some, and some crossword constructors have really developed a voice. It's a really interesting question about what voice amounts to. I wrote a sort of short follow-up piece called The Art and Style of Crosswords, which is in the Philosophers magazine, which talks a little bit more about what elements of a crossword are capable of giving rise to voice or style. But lots of people in the crossword community talk about the voice of a puzzle. And often that's a feature of the kind of range of references that they're using. Is there a lot of sort of highbrow literary references? Is there a lot of references to particular subcultures, sort of what's going on here? But then also some of it is really, do they tend to make sort of low word count themeless puzzles? Do they like, the use of triple or quadruple stacks of long 15-letter answers? So there are other elements. Do they like grid art? These can all be stylistic for a constructor. So I think that the fact that we see style in crosswords is, again, some more evidence that some crosswords at least, can be.
Yeah, and I'm sure, too, that you could see the evolution of a constructor's style over time, right? That they sort of change and evolve in a way that an artist does.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, there are some crosswords, actually, that if I didn't even see the byline, I could tell you who they were by. And again, this is like a very sort of niche connoisseur thing. But again, there's some evidence there that you can, these are not just sort of undistinguished puzzles, but that the very best puzzles, at least, are those that are letting some of the constructor's own individual agency sort of shine forth Yeah.
In the way that, tying it back to T's book, right? Like a game designer, you're getting something of them,
Yeah.
and you're sort of interacting with them, or part of them. So your agency is interacting with their agency, and it's the agency they've created for you.
Yeah, completely. And again, I think that's part of what we can appreciate, not just sort of the solved grid or the appearance of the grid, but like the way in which the constructor can create or afford this experience for you. In the piece in the Philosophers magazine, I talk a little bit about something I work on in other work, this notion of a kind of an aesthetic reactive attitude. So an attitude we can have toward another person's agency, in this case, an artist's agency, in the experience that we get from them of their works. And so one aesthetic reactive attitude we can have is gratitude. I can feel really grateful to a constructor for giving me this awesome experience. I also will say, like, I won't name names, I resent some crossword constructors, like, and that's another paradigmatic reactive attitude. And I think that's actually appropriate in some cases. So yeah, there's a longer story to be told about that. But again, I think that's some evidence that we're working with something which is very much like an art, if not fully in the domain of the artistic as well.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I look forward to hearing that story another time, perhaps in subsequent published works, or else in just subsequent conversations with you. So I think we'll end it there. Robbie, thank you so much for joining me. This was an awesome conversation.
Thanks so much, Brandon.